There's a stone tomb outside Rome that nobody visits anymore. Cracked, overgrown. Tourists walk right past it, chasing something louder. The Colosseum, the temples, the postcard version of the empire. But if you stop, if you kneel down and read what's carved into that rock, you'll find the first sentence any Roman ever wrote about himself. Not a myth, not a legend. A real man describing his own life, in his own words, 25 centuries ago. And what he wrote should unsettle you a little, because it's not so different from what men still carve into their own lives today. Ambition, conquest, the need to be remembered by someone, anyone after you're gone. This is the story of how a handful of villages on a riverbank became the most powerful empire the world has ever known, and quietly built the world you're standing in right now. Your laws, your calendar, your roads, even your excuses. We start before the armies, before the emperors, before the madness. We start with a lie the Romans told about themselves, and the truth buried underneath it. Every empire needs an origin story it can be proud of. Rome's is a bloodbath dressed up as a fairy tale, a princess forced into motherhood by a god of war, twin boys thrown into a flooding river by a king who feared them, a she-wolf finding them on the bank instead of leaving them to die, a shepherd raising them as his own. And then when the boys became men, a fight over where exactly to build a city. A fight that ended with one brother killing the other. Romulus murdered Remus, and then he named the city after himself. Think about that for a second. Not Rome, founded by two brothers who built something together. Rome, founded by a man who eliminated his own blood to make sure the glory belonged to him alone. That's not a footnote in the story. That's the whole story, told in miniature before the empire had even built its first wall. The Romans knew this. They told the story anyway. Generation after generation, they carved it into monuments, painted it on temple walls, taught it to their children. A nation built on the memory of a fratricide, and somehow proud of it. You have to ask yourself why. Why would a civilization choose, as its founding myth, the story of a brother killing a brother? Because it was honest, not historically. Archaeologists will tell you Rome was really just a cluster of hillside villages that merged around 625 BC, probably for protection. Nothing divine about it, but honest in a different way. Honest about what Rome actually was, underneath every later claim of order and law and civilization. A place built on the willingness to do what needed to be done, even against your own blood, and to live with it afterward without flinching. That tension between the polished myth and the brutal instinct underneath it never left Rome. It just got bigger, more sophisticated, dressed in better clothes. Here's the detail almost nobody talks about. Romulus had a city but no citizens. So what did he do? He didn't wait for noble families to arrive. He opened the gates to criminals, runaway slaves, debtors, the forgotten and the unwanted from every corner of Italy. He built Rome, quite literally, out of people other cities had thrown away. Every other ancient city liked to imagine its people had sprung up from the very soil they stood on, pure, original, untouched by outsiders. Rome told the opposite story. Rome said, "We are the ones nobody else wanted, and we built an empire anyway." There's something almost defiant in that. A city of outcasts deciding it would answer to no one, needing nothing from the world except the will to take it. But Romulus still had a problem. A city of criminals and outcasts was still a city with no women, no future, no next generation. And the neighboring towns wouldn't just hand their daughters over to a settlement of ex-slaves and fugitives. So Romulus did what desperate men in power have always done. He lied. He invited the neighboring tribe, the Sabines, to a religious festival. And in the middle of the celebration, on his signal, his men seized every young woman they could grab and carried them off to be Roman wives. History calls it the rape of the Sabine women. Roman art, for centuries afterward, depicted it almost proudly. Women being dragged, women trying to flee, women realizing there was no escaping what was already happening to them. Some of Rome's enemies later said this was exactly who the Romans were. If they wanted something, they simply took it. No negotiation, no patience, just force, dressed up afterward as destiny. You can dismiss all of this as ancient myth, disconnected from anything real. Except the Romans themselves didn't dismiss it. When they later built a monument in the heart of their city to honor the generals who won Rome's greatest victories, they didn't start the list with some forgotten war hero. They started it with Romulus, a man who killed his own brother, a man who kidnapped his neighbor's daughters. That was the founder Rome chose to celebrate first, above all others, for the rest of its history. There's a version of history, the sanitized one, the one built for postcards and textbooks, where Rome is a story of law, order, architecture, philosophy. All of that came, all of that is real, but none of it explains how Rome kept winning, century after century, against people who were often just as brave, just as organized, sometimes better equipped. What explains it is something colder. Rome didn't just conquer people, it absorbed them. It gave them a reason to stop fighting and start belonging. And that instinct, turning enemies into citizens, outsiders into insiders, started here in a myth about a murderer and a stolen bride, long before it became imperial policy. The lie Rome told about itself wasn't really a lie. It was a warning about what this civilization would become, about what it would be willing to do and who it would be willing to use to build something that would outlast every single person who built it. Nobody listened to the warning. They just kept building. By 509 BC, the kings were gone. The last one, Tarquin the Proud, had let his family's cruelty go one step too far. And the people of Rome did something almost nobody in the ancient world dared to do. They didn't just replace one king with another. They abolished the position entirely. In its place, they built something new. 2 elected leaders called consuls, serving 1 year at a time, each one able to veto the other. A Senate split between wealthy patricians and working-class plebeians, arguing endlessly over who actually held the power. On paper, it looked like balance. In practice, the rich almost always won. That imbalance never fully healed. It sat there quietly for 500 years, waiting. But here's what people miss about early Rome. This wasn't yet a superpower. This was a mid-sized town surrounded by rivals just as hungry, just as violent. The Gauls sacked it in 390 BC and burned half the city to the ground. If you'd been standing in Rome that year, watching the smoke rise over your home, you would not have guessed you were looking at the beginning of the most dominant civilization in human history. You would have guessed you were watching it end. Rome rebuilt. That's not the interesting part. Every city rebuilds. What's interesting is what Rome did differently once it got back on its feet, because this is the moment the real machine started running, and it's a machine you'll recognize because versions of it still run the world today. Here's how war normally worked in ancient Italy. One town raids another, takes some cattle, some slaves, maybe burns a few buildings, goes home. Repeat next season. It wasn't organized conquest. It was glorified theft with a seasonal schedule. Rome played the same game, at first, but then it did something almost nobody else was doing. Instead of just taking what it could carry and going home, Rome started making permanent arrangements with the towns it defeated. Not enslavement, not always. Something stranger, something smarter. Rome told the people it had just beaten, "You will provide us soldiers when we call for them, and in return you get something you didn't have before. Protection, infrastructure, a share in whatever we build next." Think about what that actually means. Rome was expanding its own army using the very people it had just conquered. Every enemy Rome defeated became, within a generation, a source of Roman military strength. It's a strange kind of judo. You don't destroy the thing that's trying to stop you. You absorb it. You make it yours. You let your enemies become the reason you keep winning. By the 3rd century BC, this machine had put more than 700,000 soldiers at Rome's disposal. Not because Rome had that many people to begin with, but because Rome had turned nearly every defeated neighbor into a supplier of manpower. No other city in Italy could outproduce that. It wasn't better weapons. It wasn't superior tactics, not yet. It was a system, one that turned military defeat for the loser into a kind of slow-motion recruitment. You see this same instinct on Rome's earliest gold coins. A scene of 2 men standing over a kneeling figure holding a pig, an oath being sworn between allies. It looks strange to modern eyes, but every Roman who saw that coin understood exactly what it meant. It was a message to Rome's allies and to Rome itself about loyalty, about what happens if you keep your word to Rome, and quietly, about what happens if you don't. This is the part of the story that gets skipped in the version built for school children. Rome's rise wasn't a straight line of ambition and genius. Nobody in early Rome was sitting around a table, plotting world domination on a map. They didn't even have accurate maps. What they had was a habit, a willingness to keep making the same brutal, practical calculation, war after war, decade after decade. Don't just beat them, use them. It's the same instinct that built the myth of Romulus, opening the gates to criminals and outcasts. Rome never cared where you came from. It cared whether you could be made useful, whether you could be folded into the machine. And by the time Rome controlled most of the Italian peninsula, that machine had grown large enough, hungry enough, to notice something on the other side of the water. Another power. Another empire, already old, already rich, already convinced it owned the Mediterranean. Rome hadn't gone looking for that fight, not directly. It started almost accidentally with a dispute between two small towns in Sicily, each one appealing for help, one to Rome, one to the empire across the sea. And in the argument that followed inside the Roman Senate, between the men who wanted peace and the men who wanted war, you can already hear the sound of something enormous getting ready to move. The name of that empire was Carthage, and what happened next would cost both sides more blood than either one could have imagined. Carthage wasn't some backwater rival. It was old money, a trading empire built by Phoenician sailors centuries before Rome had even settled its own borders. It controlled the Western Mediterranean the way a bank controls a city, quietly, through leverage, through ships, through gold. And when Rome decided it wanted a piece of that world, it wasn't picking a fight with an equal. It was picking a fight with an empire that had every reason to believe it would win. What followed was 120 years of war, spread across 3 brutal conflicts. And if you only remember one name from all of it, remember this one: Hannibal. He wasn't just a general. He became something closer to a ghost story. Roman mothers used his name to frighten their children into behaving. Hannibal is at the gates, and they weren't exaggerating for effect. Hannibal did something no Roman strategist believed was possible. He marched an army, war elephants included, across the Alps, through terrain that should have destroyed his forces before they ever reached Italian soil. And then he stayed. For over a decade, Hannibal moved through Roman territory nearly undefeated, humiliating army after army, picking apart Rome's confidence piece by piece. Here's what almost nobody tells you about that period. There was a real moment, more than one, where Rome should have lost, where the empire we now treat as historical inevitability was actually hanging by a thread, held together by stubbornness alone. Rome lost tens of thousands of men in a single afternoon at Cannae, one of the worst single-day military defeats in ancient history. And Rome's answer wasn't brilliance. It wasn't a masterstroke, it was refusal. A flat, grinding refusal to admit the war was over, even when every rational calculation said it should have been. That's worth sitting with for a second because it tells you something about how empires are actually built. Not through some myth of destiny, but through a kind of stubbornness that looks, from the outside, almost irrational. Rome didn't outfight Hannibal. For years it couldn't. What Rome did was outlast him. It kept feeding new armies into the fire, kept absorbing losses that should have broken a lesser state, until eventually the war shifted somewhere Hannibal couldn't follow, onto Carthage's own soil in North Africa, where a Roman general named Scipio finally beat him. Rome won the Second Punic War, and for most civilizations, that would have been the end of the story. You beat your rival, you take some territory, you move on. But Rome wasn't finished, not really, because somewhere in the decades that followed, something changed in the way Rome talked about Carthage. It stopped being a rival to be managed and started being a threat that needed to be erased. There was a senator, Cato the Elder, who reportedly ended every single speech he gave in the Senate, no matter the topic, with the same 3 words: Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. It didn't matter what the debate was actually about. taxes, roads, foreign policy, didn't matter. He'd finish every argument the same way, hammering the same idea into the minds of Rome's leadership year after year, until it stopped sounding like paranoia and started sounding like policy. That's how the Third Punic War began. Not because Carthage posed any real military threat anymore. It barely had an army left worth the name. Rome went to war with a rival it had already beaten, because some part of the Roman psyche couldn't tolerate the idea of a former enemy simply existing, rebuilding, recovering. What happened in 146 BC wasn't a battle. It was an extermination. Roman soldiers tore through the city, looted what they could carry, and burned the rest to the ground. Greek historians who documented the aftermath recorded roughly 200,000 dead. The remaining survivors, fewer than 1,000 people from what had once been one of the great cities of the ancient world, were sold into slavery. Carthage, a civilization that had stood for centuries, simply stopped existing. Ask yourself, what kind of empire does that? Not out of necessity, out of something closer to compulsion. The people who write history like to describe this as strategic caution, Rome protecting itself from a resurgent rival. But sit with the scale of it for a second. An entire city burned to ash, its population erased, because Rome couldn't leave a defeated enemy alone long enough to simply fade into irrelevance. This is the part of Rome's story that the postcard version conveniently leaves out. We like our empires to have clean origin stories, brave founders, noble laws, inevitable greatness. But greatness at this scale was never clean. Rome didn't just win wars, it made sure its enemies couldn't come back to ask questions later. And in that same fateful year, 146 BC, while Carthage burned in the west, Rome was busy doing something eerily similar in the east, sacking Corinth, the wealthiest city in Greece, for entirely separate reasons. Two ancient, proud civilizations reduced to rubble in the same 12 months by an empire that had, by then, stopped asking whether it should win and started only asking how completely. Rome had learned something dangerous about itself in those wars. It had learned that there was no ceiling, no rival strong enough to stop it, no ancient city sacred enough to be spared, no line it wouldn't eventually cross if the outcome served its ambition. That kind of power doesn't stay stable for long. It changes the people who hold it, and it was about to change Rome from the inside in ways far more dangerous than any foreign army ever could. Power like that doesn't just sit quietly once you have it. It starts looking for a place to go. And by the time Rome had erased Carthage and humbled Greece, something had shifted inside the Republic itself. A hunger that no longer pointed outward, at foreign enemies, but inward, at the men standing next to you in the Senate. For a while, the Republic tried to manage that hunger the old way. Elections, alliances, compromise. But compromise only works when everyone involved still believes the system is bigger than any one man. And by the 1st century BC, fewer and fewer Romans believe that anymore. Enter Julius Caesar, not a king, not yet, a politician, a general, a man with debts most people would consider career-ending, and an ambition that made those debts look small by comparison. Rome sent him north with a mandate: bring Gaul under Roman control, the territory that today spans France, Belgium, and parts of Germany and Switzerland. What Rome got instead was something closer to a personal war of conquest, 6 years of campaigning so brutal it would define the rest of Caesar's life, and arguably the rest of Rome's. The Gauls weren't disorganized tribes waiting to be absorbed. They were fierce, independent, and led eventually by a chieftain named Vercingetorix, who understood exactly what was coming and rallied his people to resist it. The decisive moment came at a hill fortress called Alesia in 52 BC. Caesar didn't storm the walls. He surrounded them, built a ring of fortifications around the entire town. Then when reinforcements arrived to break the siege, built a second ring facing outward, trapping his own army between two enemy forces and holding both of them off at once. It's one of the most audacious feats of ancient military engineering, and it worked. Alesia fell. Vercingetorix surrendered. The numbers that came out of that campaign are staggering, and historians still argue over how much to trust them. The biographer Plutarch claims Caesar's forces fought 3 million Gauls over the course of the war, killed 1 million of them, enslaved 1 million more. Even if those figures are inflated, and they probably are, Roman generals were not above padding their own legend. The scale of the violence wasn't in question. Caesar didn't just defeat Gaul, he nearly emptied it. He came home to Rome as the most famous man alive. And here's where you start to understand something true about power that most people never let themselves fully absorb. Fame at that scale isn't safety, it's a target. The Senate, watching Caesar's popularity swell into something they could no longer contain, ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. Strip the general down to just a man again. Sit back in line with everyone else. Caesar's answer was one sentence. And it's the kind of sentence that echoes for 2,000 years because it captures something universal about the moment right before a man decides there's no going back. He led his army to the edge of a small river called the Rubicon, the legal boundary beyond which no general was permitted to bring troops into Roman territory. And he crossed it anyway. The die is cast, he reportedly said. Not a plan, not a calculation. A surrender to momentum, an acceptance that whatever happened next was now out of his hands. Civil war followed. Caesar against Pompey, once his ally, now his rival, backed by the Senate itself. At the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC, Caesar crushed him. Pompey fled to Egypt, hoping for sanctuary, and instead found a knife. The Egyptian king, hoping to win Caesar's favor, had him murdered and presented his severed head as a gift. Caesar, so the story goes, wept at the sight of it. Whether that grief was real or performance, history doesn't say. Maybe Caesar himself couldn't have told you. With no rivals left standing, Caesar declared himself dictator for life. And here's the part that complicates the easy version of this story. The version where Caesar is simply a tyrant who destroyed a noble republic. Because in the 5 years he actually held power, Rome genuinely improved. Roads were built, laws were reformed. Debt relief reached the poor in ways the old aristocratic Senate had never bothered to attempt. Ordinary Romans didn't experience Caesar's rule as tyranny. They experienced it as the first time in a generation that anyone in power seemed to actually notice they existed. But a small group of senators watched the same events and saw something entirely different. Not a reformer. A man slowly erasing the very idea of a republic, one popular policy at a time, replacing 500 years of shared power with the will of a single man who happened, for now, to be using that power well. They told themselves they weren't murdering a leader. They were saving an institution. Their leaders were Cassius and Brutus. Brutus, a man Caesar reportedly loved like a son, possibly more than that if the old rumors about Brutus's mother are true. On the 15th of March, 44 BC, the Ides of March, Caesar walked into a Senate meeting surrounded by men he trusted. They approached him under the pretense of a petition. Then the knives came out, 23 wounds. In the chaos, Caesar is said to have caught sight of Brutus among his attackers and spoke his final words. "You too, Brutus?" The conspirators believed they were restoring the Republic. What they actually did was detonate it. Rome didn't return to the old balance of consuls and senate. It descended into chaos, grief, and rage. And out of that wreckage, a new kind of power was about to rise. One that wouldn't even bother pretending to share authority with anyone. The Republic Rome had built 500 years earlier, out of the ashes of a hated monarchy, was already dead. It just hadn't been buried yet. Out of the wreckage of Caesar's murder came a young man almost nobody in Rome took seriously at first. Caesar's grandnephew, adopted as his son and heir, a teenager named Octavian, physically unimpressive, chronically sick, the kind of man the seasoned generals around him assumed would be swallowed up within a year. They were wrong. And the way they were wrong tells you something important about power, that it doesn't always belong to the strongest man in the room. Sometimes it belongs to the most patient one. Octavian formed an alliance with two of Caesar's former generals, Mark Antony and a lesser-known figure named Lepidus. Together, they hunted down Caesar's assassins and crushed the remnants of the Senate's resistance at the Battle of Philippi. Rome once again was divided among the men who now controlled it. Octavian in the west, Antony in the east, Lepidus quietly pushed toward the margins until he had nothing left to hold on to. Two men remained, and two men sharing absolute power has never, in the history of the world, stayed peaceful for long. While ruling the east, Antony fell into a relationship with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, a woman who had before him been involved with Caesar himself. Octavian understood, better than almost anyone in history before or since, the raw power of a story well told. He didn't need to defeat Antony militarily first. He needed to defeat him in the minds of the Roman people. He built a campaign painting Antony as a man who had abandoned Rome, who had gone native, who was under the spell of a foreign queen plotting to rule the empire herself. Whether any of that was true mattered less than how effectively it spread. War followed. At the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, Octavian's fleet destroyed the combined navy of Antony and Cleopatra. They fled to Egypt. Octavian pursued. By 30 BC, both of them had taken their own lives rather than be paraded through Rome in chains. Octavian stood alone, every rival gone, every threat neutralized. And here's the moment that changes everything about how you should understand what empire actually means. Because Octavian didn't call himself king. He knew Rome's hatred of that word ran too deep, ran all the way back to the tyrant they'd overthrown 5 centuries earlier. Instead, he took a new name, Augustus. Roughly, the revered one. A title with no exact precedent, carrying weight without carrying the poison of monarchy. The Roman Empire, in the way we understand it today, officially began with that single word. Augustus ruled for 41 years, and if you strip away the mythology, what he actually did was remarkably unglamorous, almost administrative. He ended the civil wars that had bled Rome dry for a generation. He reformed the tax system. He reorganized the military into a standing professional force instead of a temporary citizen levy. He invested relentlessly in infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, public buildings. He gave Rome the one thing it had been starving for through decades of assassination and civil war: stability, predictability, the simple, unglamorous relief of knowing what tomorrow would look like. Historians call this period the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And it's worth sitting with what that phrase actually means, because peace, at the scale of an empire, is rarely gentle. It doesn't mean the absence of violence. It means violence has been so thoroughly monopolized by one authority that nobody else has the strength left to fight back. The peace Augustus built wasn't the peace of harmony. It was the peace of exhaustion, an empire so dominant that resistance had simply become pointless. Before he died, Augustus wrote his own account of his achievements, meant to be displayed publicly after his death. Hundreds of lines, effectively a blueprint for how to rule. Read it closely and 3 obsessions surface again and again. Be generous to the people. Build constantly, visibly, undeniably. And above all, expand the borders of Rome. Because an emperor who stops conquering starts looking, to his own people, disturbingly ordinary. When Augustus died in 14 AD at the age of 75, Rome did something it had never officially done for any mortal man. It declared him a god. The month of August still carries his name, quietly, in nearly every calendar on Earth, whether the people using it know the history or not. But here's the part almost nobody wants to sit with. The system Augustus built, stability, prosperity, absolute power concentrated in a single family, solved Rome's chaos by trading it for something else entirely. Rome no longer had to worry about civil war between rival generals. Now it only had to worry about what kind of man would inherit that power next. And unlike a republic where a bad leader eventually faced an election, a bad emperor faced nothing at all. No mechanism to remove him, no check on his appetite, just an empire waiting to see what he'd do with it. For a while, the men who inherited that throne were merely flawed. Augustus's successor, Tiberius, ruled with paranoia and suspicion, retreating eventually to a private island, leaving Rome to be governed almost by remote control. A period, unnoticed by most of the empire at the time, that happened to overlap with the crucifixion of a Jewish preacher in a minor province called Judea, a man named Jesus, whose death would matter more to the future of Rome than anyone in the imperial court could have possibly imagined. But after Tiberius, the throne stopped attracting merely flawed men. It started attracting something else, something the stabilizing machine Augustus built had never accounted for. Because a system built to concentrate absolute power in one bloodline has no defense at all against the day that bloodline produces someone genuinely, dangerously unwell. That day was coming. And when it arrived, it would arrive wearing the face of a teenager. Caligula came to power at 24, and for a few months Rome allowed itself to believe it had gotten lucky. He was young, he was popular, he was the son of a beloved general. Then something in him broke. Historians still argue about what exactly. Illness, power, grief over a dead sister he may have loved in ways no Roman was supposed to admit. And what followed was 3 years that read less like governance and less like history and more like a fever dream. He had men executed on invented charges, sometimes simply because their wealth was convenient. He is said to have declared himself a living god and demanded his statue be placed in the temple in Jerusalem, an act so provocative it nearly triggered a Jewish revolt on its own. Whether every story about Caligula is true is genuinely uncertain. Much of what survives was written by men who had every reason to make his successors look better by comparison. But the core of it wasn't propaganda. His own guards, the men sworn to protect him with their lives, ambushed him in a palace corridor and killed him. Nobody was ever fully certain who gave the order. Rome didn't mourn him. Rome exhaled. What came next was Claudius, the stuttering, limping uncle nobody in the family had ever taken seriously, dragged out from behind a curtain, according to legend, and made emperor almost as a joke by soldiers who assumed he'd be easy to control. He turned out to be far more competent than anyone expected, and it didn't matter. His own wife, Agrippina, is widely believed to have poisoned him, clearing the path for her teenage son to take the throne instead. That son was Nero. And if you only remember one name from this entire era, it should probably be his. Not because he was the cruelest, but because he became the permanent symbol of what happens when absolute power lands on someone who was never built to hold it. He had his own mother murdered, reportedly after multiple failed attempts, because her influence over him had become unbearable to his ego. He bankrupted the imperial treasury on excess. He executed critics without trial, without hesitation, without visible remorse. And when Rome caught fire in 64 AD, a fire that destroyed roughly 2/3 of the city, Nero needed someone to blame, and he chose a small, unpopular religious sect that had recently been spreading through the empire's poorer neighborhoods, the Christians. That decision would echo for centuries. Nero fiddled while Rome burned. You've heard that phrase, maybe without knowing where it came from. Most historians now believe it was invented later. Propaganda from his enemies, partly because the fiddle as an instrument didn't even exist yet in Nero's Rome. But the persecution that followed the fire was real. Christians were rounded up, tortured, executed publicly as entertainment, a religious minority made into scapegoats by a young emperor's need to deflect blame from himself. Nero's grip on power finally collapsed. The governor of Spain rose against him, support evaporated overnight, and Nero fled the city he once ruled absolutely. He was declared an enemy of the state by the very Senate that had once bowed to him, and at 30 years old, he took his own life. The bloodline that stretched all the way back to Augustus, the family that had built the empire's stability, ended with him. If you're still with me at this point in the story, I want to ask you to do something simple. If this is the kind of history that actually pulls at something in you, not the sanitized textbook version, but the real one, the one with blood still on it, subscribe to the channel and come back tomorrow. We put out content like this every single day, and it means something, genuinely, that you've stayed this far into a video this long. That's not nothing. Most people don't make it this deep. And here's a question worth sitting with while we keep going. How many of the men running your own world right now would survive the kind of unchecked power Nero had? Not because they're worse people, because absolute power was never built to be survived by anyone. Rome learned that the hard way over and over, and somehow kept forgetting the lesson every single generation. Because what came after Nero was even stranger. In a single year, 69 AD, 4 different men claimed the throne of the most powerful empire on earth. One was struck down by his own bodyguards in the street. Another, a genuinely capable man by most accounts, took his own life after just 3 months in power, rather than send more soldiers to die for his ambition. A third marched into Rome and let his own troops loot and terrorize the very citizens he was supposed to now govern, until the people dragged him out themselves and threw his body in the river. It took a fourth man, a disciplined general named Vespasian, to finally end the chaos and begin what historians now call Rome's Golden Age. A run of emperors, Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, under whom the empire reached its largest size, its greatest wealth, its most enduring monuments. Marcus Aurelius, in particular, spent most of his reign fighting wars on the frontier, and somehow, in the gaps between campaigns, wrote a private journal of philosophy that survives today as one of the most read books in the world. A Roman emperor, quietly, at night, questioning his own mind the same way you might question yours. But golden ages don't last. They never do. Marcus Aurelius's own son, Commodus, inherited the throne next, and cared more about performing as a gladiator in the arena than governing an empire. His inner circle eventually had him strangled in his own bathtub. Rome had built and rebuilt again, the same fragile machine, absolute power handed down by blood, with no guarantee at all about what kind of man would be waiting to receive it next. And this time, when it broke, it wouldn't just be one bad emperor. It would be almost 30 of them in a single century, tearing the empire apart from the inside faster than any foreign army ever could. Over the next 100 years, more than 25 men wore Rome's crown, and almost every single one of them died with someone else's knife already drawn. At one point, the emperor's own bodyguard, the Praetorian Guard, the men sworn to die protecting him, simply murdered the man on the throne and auctioned off the empire to whoever could pay the most for it. One emperor's reign lasted 22 days. 22 days to rule the most powerful civilization on earth before someone else decided his time was over. Rome had built a machine that could conquer almost anything outside its borders. It had never built anything that could survive what was happening inside them. In 285 AD, an emperor named Diocletian looked at the wreckage and made a decision no one before him had dared to make. He split the empire in two, east and west, each with its own ruler, because one man, one capital, could no longer hold the weight of what Rome had become. And then, stranger still, when his time came, he did something almost no Roman emperor in 5 centuries had ever done voluntarily. He stepped down. He walked away from absolute power and simply went home to grow cabbages. The war that followed his retirement produced a man named Constantine. Before a decisive battle for control of the empire, he claimed to have seen a cross of light burning in the sky, and took it as a sign from a god that most of Rome, at the time, still didn't worship. He won that battle, and in the years after, he did something that would outlast every legion Rome had ever raised. He made Christianity, the same faith Nero had once fed to the flames as scapegoats, the same faith that had gotten a young mother named Perpetua thrown to wild animals in an arena a century earlier for refusing to renounce it. He made it the official religion of the empire. One vision, one battle, 2,000 years of consequences that are still shaping the world you live in right now, whether you've ever set foot in a church or not. But even that couldn't hold the empire together forever. After Constantine, the West and the East drifted apart for good. The eastern half, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, grew wealthier, stronger, and would go on surviving for another 1,000 years. The western half, the Rome of legend, the Rome of the Colosseum and the Forum, and the myths you grew up half remembering, kept bleeding. Its treasury emptied, its borders thinned, and the people standing outside those borders, the ones Rome had spent centuries calling barbarians, started to notice. In 476 AD, a Germanic general removed the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire from power. No great final battle, no dramatic last stand worthy of the myths that came before it. Just an ending, almost administrative in its quietness, the same way most real endings actually happen. And here's the detail history seems to have arranged on purpose. the kind of detail you couldn't invent if you tried. The name of that last emperor, the final man to sit on the throne Augustus built 500 years earlier, was Romulus, the same name as the boy who killed his own brother to found the city in the first place. 12 centuries later, Rome ended carrying the exact same name it was born with. Think about what that means for a second. Not as trivia, as a mirror, a civilization that began with one man's willingness to eliminate everything standing between him and power, ending with a man who shared his name, watching that same power finally run out. Rome didn't get betrayed by outsiders in the end. It got exhausted by its own appetite, the same appetite that built it in the first place, the one it never once in 1,000 years figured out how to satisfy. You're still living inside what's left of it. The laws you're governed by trace their architecture back to Roman courts. The language you're hearing right now carries Latin in its bones, whether you notice it or not. The calendar on your wall, the roads under your car, the very idea that a republic could exist at all. Rome built the blueprint, and every civilization since has been drawing from it, knowingly or not. Empires don't usually fall the way we imagine. No single barbarian at the gate, no single bad decision. They erode slowly from choices made generations earlier by men who were long dead by the time the bill came due. Rome conquered nearly the entire known world. And in the end, the thing that finally beat it wasn't an army. It was itself. If you made it this far, you already know this isn't the kind of history that gets taught with any real honesty in most classrooms. It's messier than that, darker than that, more human than that. If it did something for you, share it with 5 people who'd actually sit through something like this. Not for the algorithm, just because some stories deserve to travel. Leave a comment, an honest one, not a 2-word one. Tell me what part of this stayed with you, and tell me what empire, what civilization, what forgotten piece of history you want us to dig into next. We'll be here tomorrow, doing this again.